Introduction. The mysterious arrival, hook and suspense. In the vast darkness of space, there was a ship, a silent, drifting husk lost among the stars. It seemed abandoned, empty. But on board, something was very wrong. Alex Carter, a skilled engineer, awoke from a deep sleep to find himself inside this vessel. His head spun as the lights flickered overhead. The cold metallic walls around him seemed to pulse with life, though no one was there. The ship, Vessel 39, had no clear origin. There were no records of its mission, and no one could explain its sudden disappearance. But now it was here, floating in space with no crew, no answers. Alex had no memory of how he arrived. One moment, he was in his quarters back on Earth, and the next, he was trapped on this eerie, abandoned ship. The silence was deafening, and yet it felt as though someone, or something, was watching him. Alex tried to sit up, rubbing his temples. His head was pounding as he tried to recall anything. But there was nothing. No memories of what happened. No explanation for the ship's strange atmosphere. A low hum vibrated through the floor beneath him. The ship's systems seemed to be alive, though its crew had long since vanished. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, the communication system crackled to life. Alex froze, his breath catching in his throat. A voice echoed through the static. "Help. We're not alone." The voice was faint, distorted by the poor connection, but Alex's heart raced. It sounded like someone in distress, but who could be on board? He looked around frantically. There were no signs of life, no crew. The ship was a ghost ship, drifting in space. His instincts kicked in. Alex quickly moved to the nearest terminal, trying to access the ship's records. As he typed furiously, the screen flickered, showing only blank data. Nothing made sense. His hands trembled. Was he hallucinating? Or was someone truly alive on this ship? Then, as if in response to his thoughts, the lights above him flickered again. This time, they flickered longer, as if something was trying to communicate. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He looked around, but the corridor remained dark and empty. Then it happened. A loud bang echoed from the walls, as though someone had slammed their fist against the ship. The noise seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Alex's heart pounded in his chest. The ship was alive, and it was trying to tell him something. He stumbled backward, his mind racing. What was happening? Was the ship haunted? Was it cursed? Or was something far worse happening? Something that he couldn't yet comprehend. Trying to steady his nerves, Alex took a deep breath and forced himself to move. He needed answers. He needed to find out what had happened here. The whispers were growing louder, like 1,000 voices murmuring in the dark. But there was no one around. No one but him. As Alex walked down the narrow corridor, he noticed something strange. The walls were covered with what looked like symbols, strange, alien markings that he didn't recognize. His hands trembled as he touched one of the symbols, the surface cold and smooth to the touch. The symbols seemed to glow faintly, as though they were alive, and a deep sense of unease washed over him. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the hall, just out of reach of the dim light. Alex's breath caught in his throat. Was it a crew member? A survivor? The figure was tall, dressed in a tattered uniform. But before Alex could approach, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but a trail of cold air and an overwhelming sense of dread. Alex stood frozen, his mind racing. What had just happened? Who, or what, was on this ship with him? The whispers returned, louder now, and Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. In a panic, he rushed to the nearest door, throwing it open. Inside, he found nothing but empty, disheveled quarters. No signs of life, just the remnants of long-forgotten crew members, broken equipment, abandoned personal items, and empty beds. But there was a message written on one of the walls in faded red paint. Don't let it find you. Alex's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced. Who wrote this message? And what did it mean? Was it a warning? Or a desperate plea from someone who had been trapped here like him? A cold gust of wind swept through the room, and the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't stop. The hum beneath Alex's feet grew louder, vibrating through the ship like a heartbeat. It felt like the ship itself was alive, breathing in the darkness. Alex turned to leave, but then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him, echoing through the corridor. He spun around, but no one was there. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He wasn't alone. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Help! We're not alone. Alex's heart raced. He was trapped. There was no escape. Not yet. The ship wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it was watching him. To survive, Alex would have to face whatever force was controlling this vessel. He had to uncover the ship's past and confront the terrifying truth before it was too late. The first few minutes had set the stage for the terror that awaited. With each passing moment, Alex's chances of survival grew slimmer, and the unknown entity aboard the haunted vessel waited patiently, its whispers growing louder and more insistent. Would Alex escape this nightmare, or would he become another lost soul aboard the haunted ship? The answer would soon unfold. The first clue: unsettling discoveries. Alex's heart pounded as he stepped cautiously out of the room, his mind swirling with fear and confusion. The message on the wall still haunted him. Don't let it find you. He had no idea who had written it or why. The words felt like a warning, but there was no time to dwell on it. His main goal was survival. He needed to find answers, and quickly. As he moved down the dimly lit corridor, the silence felt suffocating. He was alone, or at least he thought he was. Yet the whispering voices seemed to follow him, bouncing off the walls, distant but clear. Help! We're not alone. The same message he'd heard through the ship's communication system. Alex gritted his teeth and pressed forward. The sound of his boots echoed in the narrow hall, amplifying the eerie silence. The ship felt like a maze, its layout unfamiliar to him. He didn't know where the crew quarters were or where he could find any useful equipment, but he had no choice but to keep moving. Then, as he rounded a corner, he saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. On the wall ahead of him was another set of strange symbols, this time glowing faintly in the darkness. They were carved into the metal, worn by time but still visible. Alex reached out, his fingers trembling as he traced the outline of the shapes. The symbols felt cold, almost unnatural, as though they were made from a material that didn't belong in this part of space. The air around him felt heavy, and a chill crept over him, causing his breath to fog up in the cold, still atmosphere of the ship. He had the distinct feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. But when he looked around, the corridor remained empty. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Alex's nerves were on edge. He needed to keep moving. But where? Suddenly, the lights above him flickered, then blinked out completely, plunging him into total darkness. His breath caught in his throat. What now? His eyes tried to adjust, but the pitch-black hallway was unforgiving. Then, a soft light appeared in the distance, flickering like a candle in the wind. Alex cautiously approached, his mind racing. Was it another crew member, or a trap set by the entity that haunted the ship? He followed the light, which led him into what appeared to be a maintenance room. There were old tools scattered around, and a few abandoned computer terminals. The light source was coming from an old console at the back of the room, its screen faintly glowing. Alex approached the console and activated it, praying it still worked. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of logs. Most were corrupted, filled with static and broken text, but one entry caught his eye. It was a log from the ship's engineer, dated just days before the ship's last known location. Alex leaned in, reading the fragmented words. Something is wrong with the ship. The systems are malfunctioning. But it's not the tech. It's something else. The crew is starting to hear voices, see things that aren't there. Captain ordered us to stay calm. But I don't think we can anymore. I think something is on board. It's not human. And it's not alone. Alex's stomach dropped. The captain's warning echoed in his mind. It's not human. What had happened to the crew? And what was this thing on board with them? The log ended abruptly. The screen blinked off, and the maintenance room returned to darkness. Alex stepped back, his heart racing. The whispers seemed to grow louder once again, creeping up behind him. He quickly shut down the console and turned toward the door, but before he could leave, he noticed something on the floor near the back of the room. A small metal object. Curious, Alex crouched down and picked it up. It was a wristband, faded and scratched, but still intact. He turned it over, and a name was etched into the metal. Lieutenant Sarah Graves. The name was unfamiliar, but the wristband felt oddly heavy in his hand. The weight of it almost felt like a warning. He slipped it into his pocket, hoping it would offer some clue to the mysterious disappearance of the crew. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him with a loud bang, causing him to jump in shock. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was in the room with him. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though they were trying to speak directly to him. He spun around, but the room was empty. The only sound was the hum of the ship's malfunctioning systems and his own ragged breathing. He had to escape before whatever was on this ship found him. The sense of being hunted was overwhelming, and every instinct told him to run. He rushed back to the corridor, his mind racing. The ship felt like it was closing in on him. He needed to find more clues, something that could explain the strange happenings and help him escape this nightmare. But as he turned the corner, he heard it again. The footsteps. They were echoing from just ahead, too loud to be a coincidence. Alex's heart raced, and he bolted down the hallway, the sound of footsteps growing louder with each step. He didn't dare turn around. The whispers grew frantic, urging him to run faster. But where could he go? He had no idea how to navigate this haunted ship. And then the sound stopped. Total silence. Alex froze, his breath caught in his throat. Something was watching him. The entity was near. It was just a matter of time before it made itself known. The haunting begins. Encounters with the entity. Alex's heart hammered in his chest as he stood frozen in the hallway, the silence pressing in on him like a heavy weight. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. He couldn't shake the feeling that the very walls around him were alive, watching his every move. He didn't know what to do next. His thoughts were racing, and his mind kept returning to the footsteps he'd heard. Were they real, or was he losing his grip on reality? The whispers had grown louder, almost deafening now, but when he stopped to listen, they disappeared as quickly as they had come. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to move forward. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, dark and narrow, and yet he felt a compulsion to keep going. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to flee, but there was nowhere to go. Every direction felt like a trap. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, faint at first, but then growing louder. It was coming from the ship's engine room. The sound seemed to beckon Alex, pulling him toward it as if it were calling his name. He knew that whatever was causing this disturbance, he needed to confront it. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to stop it. He moved toward the engine room, the dim lights overhead flickering erratically. As he approached, the temperature dropped sharply. Alex shivered, rubbing his arms for warmth, but the coldness only seemed to intensify. When he reached the entrance to the engine room, he hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he could see nothing but darkness. The hum was louder now, vibrating in his chest, like a pulse. He pushed the door open slowly, his hand trembling as he gripped the handle. Inside, the room was vast, filled with towering engines and pipes snaking across the walls. The air was thick with the smell of rust and oil, and the low hum was almost overwhelming. But it wasn't just the hum that unsettled him. It was the presence, the feeling that he wasn't alone. He could sense it, like a shadow looming over him, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Alex's breath caught in his throat. He stood still, straining to listen, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. Then, without warning, the lights flickered once more, and something moved in the shadows. A figure, pale and indistinct, appeared at the far end of the room. Alex's stomach twisted into knots as he instinctively took a step back. The figure didn't move like a human. It was as if it was floating, drifting toward him without touching the ground. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed by fear, watching as the figure slowly approached. Its features were unclear, obscured by the darkness, but Alex could make out its shape, a tall, thin silhouette with outstretched arms. Then the whispers returned, this time louder and clearer than before. "Get out. Get out now." The voice was sharp, urgent, filled with terror. But the figure didn't stop. It continued to glide toward him, its presence growing stronger, suffocating him. Alex scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking as he turned around. The figure was closer now, standing just a few feet away, its pale face coming into view. It was human, or at least it had been. The face was twisted, deformed, as though something had corrupted it. Its eyes were hollow, black as coal, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque, silent scream. A surge of terror flooded through Alex, but he couldn't move. His legs felt like they were made of lead. The figure raised one of its hands, fingers elongated and sharp like claws, reaching toward him. Alex's mind raced. He needed to act, but his body refused to obey. This wasn't just a ghost. It wasn't just an illusion. This was real. The entity, whatever it was here with him, and it was more dangerous than he could have imagined. Then, out of sheer instinct, Alex lunged to the side, dodging the figure's grasp by mere inches. The figure recoiled, and for the first time, Alex heard it, a low, guttural growl, like the sound of a wild animal. It wasn't human. Not anymore. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline surging through him. He didn't know how long he could keep running, but he had to try. The ship was alive with danger, and whatever was chasing him wasn't going to let him go easily. He rushed toward the exit, but the door remained shut. Desperately, Alex slammed his shoulder into the door, but it didn't budge. The figure was closing in on him again, its distorted face twisted in a silent mockery of a grin. Then, just as it reached out to grab him, the door swung open. Alex stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The whispers were still there, following him, growing louder as the figure lingered in the shadows. The entity was real, and it was hunting him. Alex had just survived his first encounter with it, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't safe. Not yet. And the worst was yet to come. You said. Desperate measures, searching for a way out. Alex's mind was racing, his body still trembling from the encounter. His chest heaved with each breath, and his legs felt like jelly beneath him. He couldn't stop. He had to keep moving. The ship, once a place of mechanical mystery, had now turned into a nightmare. The entity was real, and it was relentless. He knew he couldn't stay in the hallway forever. He needed to find a way to escape, but how? The ship's systems were a maze, its corridors endless. The thought of returning to the engine room, where the entity had nearly caught him, made his stomach churn. But he had no choice. He needed to figure out how the ship was being controlled and how to shut down whatever it was that had taken over. There was only one place left to go, the command center. If the control systems were still intact, maybe he could find something that could explain what had happened. Maybe there was a way to override the entity's influence and escape the ship. Alex moved cautiously down the hallway, keeping his eyes on every shadow. The silence was almost worse than the whispers. He could feel the entity lurking, watching from the corners, waiting for him to make a mistake. The ship's lights flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The door to the command center loomed ahead, its surface scratched and dented, as if someone had tried to force it open. Alex swallowed hard, his throat dry, and placed his hand on the door handle. The cool metal sent a shiver down his spine, but he gripped it tightly, determined to face whatever lay beyond. With a deep breath, Alex yanked the door open. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of monitors scattered across the walls. The command center was eerily quiet, like a tomb. It smelled of dust and old electronics, the air stale, but it was still functional, at least partially. The main console flickered to life when Alex pressed a button, casting a faint greenish glow over the room. He approached the console cautiously, his hand shaking as he tried to bring up the ship's logs. The screen was filled with lines of corrupted data, but there were still fragments of information. As Alex scrolled through the logs, one entry caught his eye, dated just days before the ship's last transmission. Entity has taken control. We've lost communication. The crew is no longer responding. We are trapped aboard Vessel 39. No one is safe. It is watching. It is hunting us. If you find this message, do not come. It will find you too. The words sent a cold shock through Alex's spine. The crew had known about the entity, and yet they had been powerless to stop it. The situation was worse than he had imagined. The entity was not only haunting the ship, it was controlling it. Alex's breath quickened as he realized that the entity was far more dangerous than just a malevolent presence. It was connected to the ship itself. The ship wasn't just haunted, it was possessed. His fingers flew over the console, trying to find a way to override the ship's systems. He accessed the ship's self-destruct protocol, hoping that it might be the answer. The system was heavily locked down, but with his knowledge of engineering, Alex was able to override a few basic security measures. He stared at the screen, the countdown beginning as he tried to process what he was about to do. Would blowing up the ship destroy the entity, or would it only make it stronger? There was no way to know. He had no choice. The longer he stayed, the more likely it was the entity would find him. A warning flashed on the screen. Self-destruct in 10 minutes. Are you sure you wish to proceed? Alex hesitated. 10 minutes. That was the amount of time he had to escape. But he couldn't leave the ship yet. He needed to find a way to stop the entity once and for all. The entity had to be contained. He quickly deactivated the self-destruct countdown for now. There was no way he was leaving this ship without first facing whatever it was that had taken control of it. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the other side of the room. Alex spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The entity was close. He could feel it, like a shadow creeping up behind him. The console screen flickered, and then a voice, distorted and twisted, rumbled from the speakers. You cannot escape. You are mine now. Alex's blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakable. It was the entity, speaking directly to him. It wasn't just a mindless force of nature. It was intelligent. It knew who he was. It had been waiting for him. He tried to think quickly. There was no way he could outrun it. No way to hide. The only option left was to fight, to use his knowledge of the ship's systems to trap the entity. The walls around him began to hum again, but this time it was a low, almost violent vibration. The ship's systems were being overridden. The entity was using the ship's control systems against him. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered more violently. Alex rushed to the console, typing furiously, trying to block the entity's control. But it was everywhere, in the walls, in the systems, in the ship itself. It was as though the entity had become one with the ship. It was the ship. The hum grew louder, and Alex could feel the temperature drop further. The floor beneath him began to tremble as if the very foundations of the ship were being torn apart. It was now or never. He had to act fast, or the entity would win. With a final, desperate move, Alex triggered the emergency release valve that would cut off the ship's power. The systems sputtered, and the lights flickered once more. The ship groaned under the strain. But Alex's breath was steady now. He had done it. He knew the entity was still out there, but for the moment, the power was down, and the ship was in chaos. Alex ran for the nearest escape pod. The countdown had already started. He had no idea whether the entity would stop its pursuit, but he had to try. Time was running out. The truth revealed. A terrifying discovery. Alex's breath came in short, desperate gasps as he sprinted down the dark, shaking corridor, the cold air biting at his skin. His heart raced, pounding in his chest like a drumbeat. He could hear it now, the soft whispers, growing louder, almost as if they were speaking directly into his ears. The entity was still on the ship, lurking in the shadows, its presence omnipresent. Every instinct screamed at him to run faster. He turned a corner, and there it was, the escape pod. It was his only chance to get off this cursed ship. But before he could reach it, the lights flickered again, and the ship let out a deep groan, as if in mourning. The ground beneath him shuddered, and the door to the escape pod slammed shut with a loud clang. "No!" Alex shouted in frustration, slamming his fist against the metal door. The whispering voices surged, louder now, almost as though they were mocking him. "You can't escape." He stepped back, his mind racing for a solution. There had to be a way to override the lock, but time was running out. The countdown for the self-destruct was already ticking, and he could feel the ship's instability growing. Every second counted. The whispers became more frantic, as though the entity itself was growing agitated, aware of his intentions. Desperately, Alex scanned the hallway, his eyes darting around for anything that could help. And then he saw it, a small access panel on the wall next to the pod. With trembling hands, Alex approached the panel and pried it open. Inside, he found a series of wires and control systems, a manual override. He didn't waste any time. Using the small tools he had on him, he began to work, his hands shaking as he connected wires and adjusted settings. But as he worked, the temperature in the hallway plummeted, and a bone-chilling cold spread through the air. His breath turned to mist in front of him, and the floor beneath him creaked, as though the very structure of the ship was about to collapse. The entity was near. Suddenly, the door to the escape pod slid open, but there was no time to celebrate. The voice of the entity echoed throughout the ship, louder and more menacing than before. "You think you can escape? You are part of me now. You will never leave." Alex's blood ran cold. He could feel the entity closing in, its presence suffocating. But he didn't hesitate. He dashed into the escape pod, closing the hatch behind him with a swift motion. He had no idea what the entity would do now, but he had to get away. As the pod's engines powered up, the ship shuddered once more, and the countdown for the self-destruct reached its final moments. Alex's heart raced, and he could hear the hum of the ship's systems as they failed, the lights flickering one last time before everything went dark. The escape pod shot into space, leaving the haunted ship behind. But even as Alex floated away, his eyes fixed on the darkness of space, something gnawed at him. The entity had been tied to the ship, but had it truly been defeated? Or was it simply waiting for him in the void of space? He checked the escape pod systems, but as he glanced at the monitors, he saw a disturbing image, a shadow moving behind him. He turned, his heart nearly stopping in his chest. There, in the reflection of the pod's window, he saw the same pale, distorted face he had encountered earlier, the entity. It was there, in the shadows, watching him. It hadn't let him go. Not yet. But then the pod jolted, and Alex's attention snapped back to the controls. The ship he had just escaped from was fading into the distance, and he could feel the pull of the stars around him. Was he free? The escape pod began to drift further away from the wreckage of the haunted vessel. The entity's presence still lingered, but it was distant now. For the moment, Alex was alone. Or so he thought. As the pod continued its journey into the deep void of space, the last message on his console flickered, a warning that flashed in bold letters. Entity detected. Reconnecting to pod systems. Not safe. Not safe. Alex's breath caught in his throat. The entity wasn't gone. It was inside the pod with him. The pod's interior began to grow colder again, and the lights flickered, as if struggling to stay alive. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around him, echoing in his ears. It's only a matter of time. The screen on the pod's dashboard flickered, showing an image of a face, the distorted, haunting face of the entity, smiling from the shadows. It was alive, and it was waiting. Alex's hands gripped the console, his knuckles white. His escape had been short-lived. The entity was more than just a presence. It was a parasite. It had attached itself to him. And now it was part of his world. No matter how far he ran, it would always be there, lurking in the shadows. And in the darkness of space, Alex knew that he was no longer alone. The real battle was just beginning. The final battle. A fight for survival. The escape pod drifted farther into the cold void of space, its systems flickering erratically, the hum of its engines stuttering as if the very fabric of the vessel itself was being torn apart. The whispers were louder now, clawing at Alex's mind, drowning out his thoughts, making his skin crawl. You cannot escape. You are mine. The voice was no longer distorted. It was sharp, cold, and impossibly real, echoing inside his head. The entity was no longer just an external force. It was inside him, wrapped around his consciousness, infiltrating his every thought. Alex gripped the control panel, his fingers slick with sweat. The coldness in the pod seemed to increase by the second. He couldn't shake the feeling that the entity was slowly suffocating him, wrapping its influence tighter with every breath he took. His pulse raced as he tried to focus on the pod systems. The countdown for the self-destruct was still active on the control panel. It was his only hope. But the entity wouldn't allow him to think clearly for long. It's pointless. You cannot defeat me. Alex slammed his fist against the console, trying to clear the fog in his mind. The ship was still intact in the distance, looming like a phantom. He realized with growing dread that the entity had not only controlled the ship, it had become one with it. The ship itself was a conduit for the entity's power, and now that power was inside the escape pod with him. He was never truly alone. The temperature in the pod dropped further, and Alex's breath became visible in the air. He could see his hands trembling as he struggled to control his rising panic. The entity's laughter, low and haunting, echoed in his ears, mingling with the whispers. He could no longer tell where the entity's influence ended and his own thoughts began. Suddenly, the pod's monitor flared to life, the words "entity recovered" flashing across the screen. Alex's blood ran cold. It had found a way into the pod systems. With a gasp, Alex snapped his attention to the emergency shoot-off controls. The entity wasn't just in his mind. It had taken over the pod's functions. The pod was no longer under his control. Desperation filled Alex's chest, but he refused to give in. He wasn't going to let this thing consume him. Not again. He pulled up the pod's auxiliary systems, overriding the entity's commands as best as he could. The ship's hull was still visible, just a speck against the infinite backdrop of stars. But there was no way he could survive the journey back to Earth with the entity controlling everything. His eyes darted between the controls, his hands moving with newfound urgency. There had to be a way to sever the entity's connection to the pod. He had to isolate the systems, prevent the entity from taking over once and for all. You can't win, Alex. The entity's voice whispered in his mind again, a mocking, serpentine hiss. You're weak. You always were. The pod suddenly jolted, and Alex was thrown against the console. The lights flickered, casting deep shadows across the cramped interior. He scrambled to his feet, fighting the urge to panic. The entity was trying to crush him, physically and mentally. It wanted him to break, to lose hope. But Alex wasn't done. He wasn't going to give the entity that victory. He found the override switch. It was the last chance. If he could access the emergency shutdown on the pod's reactor, it might force the entity out. The ship's systems would shut down entirely, cutting off its influence. He was out of time. The countdown on the self-destruct was ticking down -5 minutes. Alex's hands shook violently as he activated the shutdown sequence, watching the control panel flash with warnings. The pod's engines began to hum louder, and the walls groaned, rattling as if the ship itself was trying to stop him. The entity was desperate now. The lights flickered one final time before going out completely. The pod was plunged into complete darkness. The only sound was the erratic peeping of the control panel. In the eerie silence, Alex could hear the entity breathing, a ragged, hollow sound. He could feel its presence all around him, suffocating him. "You can't shut me down. I am everywhere." Suddenly, a sharp pain exploded in Alex's head, an all-consuming, blinding agony as the entity clawed its way deeper into his consciousness. His vision blurred, and he collapsed to the floor, gripping his skull as if he could force the entity out with sheer will. The pod systems were failing. The countdown was almost at 0. Alex fought back the darkness creeping into his mind. This was it. This was his moment. With a final, desperate effort, he activated the emergency shutdown. The whole pod shook violently as the reactor powered down, cutting the entity's connection. The lights blinked back on, and the sounds of the ship's systems grinding to a halt filled the air. Alex collapsed back against the floor, gasping for breath. The entity's whispers were gone. The weight that had pressed on his chest was lifted. But as the pod systems reset and the countdown stopped, Alex knew the fight was far from over. The entity might have been temporarily driven out of the systems, but it was still alive. The escape pod's hull started to rattle again, and Alex felt a growing sense of dread. The entity wasn't gone. It had only been delayed. It had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Alex had bought himself some time, but not enough. He had won the battle, but the war had just begun. The entity would always be there, in the shadows, always watching, always waiting for its next chance to claim him. In that moment, Alex understood one thing completely. He was never truly alone. The entity would follow him, wherever he went. The escape, freedom or new nightmare. The escape pod drifted silently through the vast emptiness of space, its engines now running at minimum power. The shaking had stopped. The lights had returned, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Alex felt a brief sense of relief. The entity's whispers were gone, and the pod systems appeared to be functioning normally once again. But despite the calm, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The cold emptiness of space, the isolation, it all felt suffocating. Had he truly escaped, or had he merely bought himself a little more time before the entity would inevitably return? He checked the pod systems again, his hands trembling as he navigated through the diagnostics. The countdown for the self-destruct on the haunted ship was no longer visible, but it didn't matter. The ship was far behind him, its wreckage fading into the distance, but that was no comfort. The entity was still out there, still following him, and it knew him now, knew his weaknesses, his fears, and the deep terror that had gripped him during their first encounter. Alex closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his racing heart. He had been through so much. The ship, the entity, the haunting presence that had controlled everything. But now, in the silence of space, he was finally free. Or so he thought. The pod's console flickered. An alert appeared. Entity detected. Warning. Reconnection imminent. Alex's blood ran cold. His mind reeled. He couldn't believe it. The entity had found its way into the pod systems again. "You are mine." The voice, deep and cold, filled the pod, and Alex's heart skipped a beat. The entity had never truly left him. It had been inside him all along, and now it was taking control of his escape pod. The lights flickered once more, and the temperature in the pod dropped sharply, the chill biting into his bones. The whispers returned, maddening and relentless. The shadows in the corners of the pod seemed to stretch and writhe, pulling him into their embrace. "You think you can escape me? You belong to me. There is no freedom." Alex felt his mind slipping again, his thoughts clouded by the entity's presence. He gripped the console desperately, trying to override the system once more, but it was useless. The entity had anticipated his every move. It knew him better than he knew himself. He had failed. But then, through the haze of panic and fear, a flicker of clarity broke through. There had to be another way. A way to sever the entity's connection completely. With what little strength he had left, Alex activated the emergency isolation mode on the pod, locking down its core systems. It was his last option, his final chance. The lights blinked erratically, and the pod groaned as if it, too, was fighting against him. The entity screamed in fury, its voice distorted and hateful. "You cannot stop me. I am everything. I am space itself." Alex's fingers hovered over the final control, the last line of defense. If he activated it, the pod would self-destruct, destroying everything within a wide radius. It was a last-ditch effort, and there was no guarantee it would work. The countdown began. 10 seconds. He knew what he had to do. He had no choice. With trembling hands, he slammed the button. The pod shuddered violently. The ship's systems, now completely disconnected from the entity, began to tear themselves apart. The core began to overheat, and sparks flew from the console. The entity's presence screamed inside his mind, its fury more intense than ever. But it was too late. The pod was already beyond the point of no return. "No, you cannot do this." The voice screamed in his mind. But Alex didn't flinch. 5 seconds. The last few moments felt like an eternity. Was this it? Was this how it all ended? But Alex didn't care anymore. He had to do this. It was the only way to stop the entity for good. 3 seconds. The pod was about to reach its critical point, but just before it did, the entity screamed one final time. A raw, unearthly wail of anguish. 1 second. And then, silence. The escape pod exploded, a massive flash of light and fire illuminating the cold expanse of space. The shockwave rippled outward, eradicating everything in its path. The remnants of the pod scattered into the dark void, the destruction absolute. In that final moment, Alex could only hope. Had the entity been destroyed, or had it merely been set free once more, waiting for the next vessel to claim? As the debris drifted farther into the void, the silence was deafening. The ship, the entity, and everything that had terrorized Alex, all of it was gone. But in the dark recesses of space, there was always the possibility that someone, would find what remained. And if the entity was still out there, it would only be a matter of time before it found its next victim. The struggle, the fight, would continue.